Hi, welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. Today's video is going to probably be a little bit boring, but at the same time kind of give you a real-time estimate of just what kind of work might go into a particular project. In this particular case, we are going to go through the process of replacing all of the capacitors in this Model 1 Sega Genesis. Now, a client sent this in because they were having some fuzzy audio, things like that. Now, it'll be due to old, worn-out capacitors, especially those in the audio subsection. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. For the most part, this will probably be a real-time, fairly silent video of me going through the complete capacitor replacement on this Model 1 Sega Genesis. So let's get started. What are we going to need for this project? Well, actually there's not too many tools that we'll need, but let's talk about the most important ones first. For starters, you're going to need capacitors. Lots and lots of capacitors. There's lots of places online where you can order these. Again, as I'm sure it will come as no surprise, I order the majority of mine through Console 5. They're just convenient, they ship quickly, and the price is fair. Get you some flush cutters. Always good to have these on hand. You might need some small electrical tweezers to kind of get in and hold some of the items in place. I'm also going to possibly use my reaming, my solder via reaming tool. Sometimes I use this if some solder, particularly some troublesome solder, just won't come out of the vias. This is good for kind of poking it out of there a little bit, although most of the time I'm very successful in getting rid of it through my desoldering pump or iron. Another set of pliers. You never know, you might need just a normal set of just some fairly grippy little pliers. A toothbrush. Yes, we want a toothbrush. That's because after we're done with all of this, and when we're done with certain sections, we're going to want to apply some isopropyl alcohol as well to clean the flux and other residue from off the areas that we've just replaced the capacitors. We're also going to want, or I would advise, that you have both a pen and possibly a Sharpie marker. Now you might be wondering, well, why do you need both? Well, you might want the pen to mark off the capacitors as you replace them on a capacitor map. What's a capacitor map? I'm glad you asked. A capacitor map is basically going to be a layout, usually printed on a sheet of paper, that has the locations of where each of the capacitors are that you would need to replace. Console 5, in this particular case, actually provides capacitor maps for most of the capacitor kits that they sell for the various models. And that's another thing to keep in mind. When you order a capacitor kit for a particular system, and especially in the case of the Model 1 Genesis, make sure you order a capacitor kit for the proper revision of Genesis you are ordering. And then last but not least, because we got to get into the thing, we need a number 2 Phillips screwdriver as well. The good thing about the Genesis is that you can pretty much get away with just using a number 2 Phillips screwdriver for the entire console, for just about every component and major PCB board assembly that needs to come out. So very handy. Obviously, pretty much a must. Optional things might be, let's go back to other requirements. Got to have some solder, of course. You know, you can't do any work without having some solder on hand. You might need a little bit of some solder flux. There is some rosin core flux in the solder I use, but if in spaces where it's very tight and there's some parts of the capacitor replacement where they're grouped very closely together, just to prevent bridging where you don't want it, the separate flux comes in handy for preventing that. And then you might also want a fiberglass pen to clean some traces off, especially if they're heavily corroded for whatever reason. Maybe there's some water damage on the PCB. I'll keep that off to the side because I may not need it. And of course, you're going to need your soldering iron. So I've got my trusty Hakko 936 station here. And that's pretty much the basics. I would also recommend that if you don't, make sure you have some way to protect yourself and the equipment, especially from ESD. That's because, of course, some of these components are older. They could be and likely are susceptible to static electricity. With that, let's get started with the disassembly of the Genesis itself. Okay, we have the Genesis taken apart now completely, and here I have the main PCB assembly where all of the capacitors that need to be replaced will be going. So a couple things before we get started here. This is where it comes in handy to have your Sharpie or pen, Sharpie and pen, honestly. And then of course we have to have the capacitors themselves. Now again, there's really only about 5 different values of capacitors that are used. So what I try to do to make it a little easier for myself when I do this, because there are so many of them, and unfortunately it's not like they're clustered where, you know, like all of these in this section are the same value and all of these are the same value. There is one spot along here where most of the audio input filter caps are located, where most of these are of the same similar values, but that's not true for the whole system. So here's my method for doing this, and of course you can do this however you want, but this is what I do that makes it a little easier. So the first thing I do is I go through all of the different capacitors and I try to lay them down. I always leave them attached to their little punch board here. It just, that way they're all in place. I don't have to worry about them rolling around and what have you, and then I just clip them off as I need them with my flush cutters. But anyway, you want to make sure that you put the capacitors basically in some sort of an order by value that makes sense to you, so that whenever you remove a particular capacitor and you know what value it is, you know exactly where you need to go to get the replacement. So you're not having to search through all of them to make sure. So in this particular case, there is the 1 microfarad 50 volt capacitors. These are the lowest capacitance values that we will need to use. Honestly, most of these do not get used until we get into the audio subsection. So these will almost kind of just sit off by themselves for the time being. So I'm just going to kind of put them up here because, again, I don't really particularly need them right offhand. Let's see, we have here a 10 microfarad capacitor. That's probably the next value in line that we need. And you can see there's quite a few of those, so we're going to want to keep these handy nearby. I'll probably keep those just right over here. And then right here we have a 100 microfarad capacitor value, so I'll just kind of set that down for a second. We also have some 220 microfarad. Most of these are in the, some of these are also in the audio subsection as well. And then let's see, we have here, I believe these are 47, yeah, so we have some 47 microfarad capacitors, and there's a few of these as well. These, I believe, are the ones we actually pretty much start off with. So again, I'm just going to kind of lay these out in a method that makes sense to me. I've also got a clean item here that I just use little paper plates, and this is where I'm going to dispose of the old capacitors once I've removed them. Again, this is just to keep them out of the way, and also helps me whenever I put one down. If for some reason I have a brain fart and I forget what the last value was, I can quickly look where I dropped it off and look at it again to make sure. But again, if you have a capacitor map, that also greatly helps. That way, if you remove a whole bunch at once and you can't remember what the values are, capacitor maps will show you this. Okay, so let's see, that's my 100. These are my 220s. So what I'm going to do here most likely is the 220s will go up here at the top. I won't be using too many of those. There are quite a few of the 100s. So I'm probably just going to set those like right over here. And then these are the 47s, like I said, that we use quite a bit of. Here are my 10s over here. So the way I kind of have this laid out, it doesn't make a ton of sense, I suppose, but it does to me, I suppose. Here are my 1 microfarad, here are the 10 microfarad, here are the 47 microfarad, here are the 100 microfarad, and then finally here are the 220 microfarad. So I kind of have a counterclockwise setup here on how I have them laid out. And that's interesting because that's kind of how I approach the replacement of the capacitors on a Sega Genesis, especially on the Model 1. Now, there's capacitors all over the board, of course. You can see them scattered here, bunch here in the video subsection area, bunch over here in the audio, what have you. But the easiest way that I have found to do this, and the quickest way, is to kind of start at one side. And in my particular case, I usually start over here by the expansion edge connector, primarily used for connecting to the Sega CD. In fact, that was the only thing it was used for here in the US. So I start with capacitors here, and I begin to sort of work my way around the board like this. But that's my method. So that's what I'm going to do now. I've got my desoldering pump already heated up and ready to go. And I have my soldering iron also heated up and ready to go. Need to get some of this old glop of solder off of it real quick that I had on there to protect the tip. And we'll get started, right? So here we go. Now, one quick note I will make here, and this will probably be one of the last things I say in this video before I am done, or unless I have to interject. Why do I have the Sharpie? Well, here's what I use the Sharpie for, and I just happen to use the silver one because it kind of blends in better with the board, which can be a good and a bad thing, but it just kind of looks more natural this way, and I'm still able to see it quite easily. What I use the Sharpie for is two reasons. One is I tend to make a dash or a dot or a line or something, a small indicator, next to the negative polarity post on the bottom side of the board. That way I know how to orient the capacitor when I replace it. Now, the reality is on the Sega Genesis boards, it actually has a positive symbol marked where the positive polarity of the capacitors go. But in some of the areas where they're really closely clustered together, this can be very confusing to identify where the plus is actually being applied. So again, I've always found it easier to just kind of mark it myself on the back side. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Is I happen to know that these three here, their negative posts are right there, so I'm just kind of marking them down. The other reason for doing this is that it helps me know which capacitors I've replaced and which ones I haven't. Now, if you want to, it's entirely up to you. I actually tend to leave the marks in place. That way, when somebody else should happen to service this, if it's not me, they'll note those little marks on the bottom of the board and they'll note, something was done here because that's not normal. Somebody did something, and hopefully they'll realize I replaced out those capacitors. It also helps me, like I said, to keep track of which capacitors I have replaced and which ones I haven't, based on looking for those little marks. Now, even though I'm using this silver Sharpie marker, I will tell you that the IPA, the alcohol, and my toothbrush or Q-tip will wipe this off. It's really not that hard to remove it, even though it's a Sharpie and usually known to be permanent. It's not to the alcohol that I'm using here, I guess. So I've got those marked, and those are going to be the first three capacitors that I replace. So what I'm going to do here first is I'm actually going to apply a little bit of new solder to each one, to each pin, because this will make it a little easier to make sure that the iron, my desoldering iron, is able to penetrate with its heat all the way through the via and help remove the solder when I go to suck it out of there. So just adding, like I said, a little bit of fresh solder to each pin. And now I'm going to remove them. Now, I could remove them all at once. Again, this is completely up to you. I prefer to remove them one at a time, so that's probably a little more time consuming. But that way I know I'm replacing each cap one by one. I make sure I have the right value in place, and I don't make as many mistakes. So with that, now let's get cracking. complete. Yes, takes a while. But as you can see, you saw me methodically go all the way around the edge of the board, capacitor by capacitor. Some of these got bent out to shape a little bit when I was grabbing it, until I had them all taken care of. That way I don't miss any of them. A couple things you may have seen me do that I didn't explain. One is that whenever I use the Sharpie marker to mark the negative polarity, I try to be careful in that I mark it on the same plane that the actual via is attached to. So, you know, I don't try to cross the Sharpie, or I don't try to make my Sharpie mark across multiple traces. And the reason for that is because sometimes you have to visually be able to look at the traces to kind of know where point A to point B goes to when you're comparing or checking components and checking continuity between components. So it helps if you're using a marker like I was to not cross over any traces if you can avoid it, just so it makes it a little easier to troubleshoot for the next person. Another thing you saw me do was I will frequently have a finger underneath the capacitor that I am removing, and the reason for that is because it's easier for me and the desoldering iron if I use the desoldering iron at the same time that I sort of wiggle the capacitor. And by doing that, I'm making sure that I'm getting all of the solder that's around the inside and around the lead of the component nice and wet, and being able to get it removed easily. It also just helps to prevent any of those leads from sticking back again after I'm done if I continue to move it after I've removed all the solder. So that's why I've done that. So really, that's pretty much it. Now, a couple things. You'll notice that I actually ended up with 3 leftover capacitors. Does this mean I missed something? No, it doesn't. The reality is that Console 5, and I would imagine a lot of other providers of capacitor kits as well, will provide extra capacitors for one of 2 reasons. One, and the most primary reason, is because not all Genesis models require the same amount or type of capacitors necessarily. So as a result, to make it easier to provide an all-in-one package, capacitor kit providers will include multiple capacitors that you may or may not need depending on which model you're working on. And in this particular case, I've replaced all of the capacitors that I physically can, and I still have 3 left over. In case you're curious, I have one of the 10 microfarad left over, I have a 220 microfarad left over, and I have a 100 microfarad left over. Now obviously, if you're not sure about this, I would highly recommend going through the capacitor map and comparing all of the capacitor locations to make sure there isn't something that you missed. But anyway, that's pretty much it. Oh, I guess another reason why you might have extra capacitors is just because whenever they get them in these sleeves like this, or whenever they get them on these sheets with the punch cardboard stock, it's probably easier for them to just kind of, oh, I know I need at least this much, and snap it off there and provide it. Capacitors in large bulk quantities are fairly inexpensive. Again, the whole kit was $5 plus shipping in this case, and you saw there were a lot of capacitors. You know, to give you an idea, here is, and in fact, let me get rid of the last remaining bits of solder as well. There we go. I started with a clean desoldering iron as well as a clean plate, and as you can see now, it is anything but. Just kind of sift through here a little bit. Here's the 2 large solder blobs from all the solder that I used in this. There's other bits as well, and then here's all of the various capacitors that were changed out on this particular Genesis. You'll also see some of the lead ends that I cut off as well from the new capacitors. So that's it. I realize this was probably not the most entertaining video ever, but again, I mainly did this just so people could have an idea as to the length of time that's kind of required to do one of these jobs and to do it properly. So thanks for hanging out with me this afternoon here at the Ivory Tower Collections and changing out the capacitors on this Sega Genesis. See you next time.